么大礼可以站着死，绝不跪着活。
要不我们一鼓作气，斩草除根，除掉这个心头大患。
这场无妄之灾，我该怎么办？
等死。
老仇死，一定要这么记仇吗？
当然。
Yuan Juzi glanced at Mr. Liu, who was sitting on the other side of the emperor. The old man immediately stood up and started to channel the mystical yin and yang power of the Liu clan to conceal the area they were in. This made it even harder for others to use the power of their mind or distance observation mystical abilities to detect what was happening here. Only then did Yuan Juzi speculate. It's extremely likely that this calamity was caused by the schemes of the other schools of thought. At the very least, they played a part in helping it along. Perhaps even Aoliang's coincidental arrival was the result of someone secretly delivering a message to him. After all, to coincidentally charge into the Great Li Empire not long after Qi Jingchun passed away? There are definitely people in the 100 schools of thought who don't want to see my branch of Mahists and the school of naturalists represented by the Liu clan to help the Great Li Empire smoothly conquer the entire eastern treasured vile continent. The emperor unclenched his fists and rubbed his cheeks. His expression was ice cold as he chuckled coldly and said, an atmosphere of war and a state of impending chaos that hasn't been seen for 1,000 years. Since things have already come to this, it's even more important that we don't lose heart. Yuan Juzi warned quietly. The emperor smiled and shook his head, replying, No, I definitely won't. So be it if it's 10 years, and so be it if it's 15 years. This is enough time to do many things. Thinking back to the previous emperors of the Great Li Empire, just how much humiliation and disdain have we suffered? My internal wounds are nothing compared to this. His speech was calm and casual, yet the man forcefully swallowed a mouthful of blood that had rushed to his throat. He lowered his head and used his fingers to massage his neck. There was ferocity and remorse on his face, though the expression of remorse quickly vanished to leave only ferocity. In the end, all that remained was an expression of resignation. As it turned out, that man had unleashed a supreme secret technique to secretly sever the emperor's heart meridian before ascending above the sky. This had comprehensively obliterated the emperor's path to immortality. Once a hidden 10th-tier cultivator brimming with vitality, the emperor's life force was now so fragile that it was shocking. Not only this, the 6 flying swords of the White Jade capital that hadn't been destroyed had all vanished into thin air as well. To put it simply, all that was left of the boundlessly powerful White Jade capital was an empty shell. It was nothing more than an imposing tower used to frighten others. To kill a cultivator at the upper 5 tiers? This was nothing but a foolish dream. In contrast to his panic and rage just then, Song Jixin had already regained his composure as he walked up to the emperor and the 2 old men. However, he still insisted on getting to the bottom of things as he asked, Yuan Juzi, Mr. Liu, can you tell me what in the world is going on? Why can't I sense any of the flying swords? The White Jade capital had 12 floors, and corresponding to this, 12 flying swords. Incense offering, pillar rock, mountain suppressing, mountain and sea, peach twig, thundering sky, purple lightning, scripture, Sanskrit chant, majestic aura, elaborate makeup, cloud pattern. The Great Li Empire had expended half of the nation's wealth to forge these 12 flying swords. Thus, they could all be regarded as genuine treasures of the empire. Including incense offering, 6 of the flying swords had already been shattered along with the godly bodies of the 6 formal gods. However, the remaining 6 formal gods had stepped aside and not challenged Aoliang at all. Thus, even if the flying swords didn't return to the White Jade capital, Song Jixin should have at least been able to sense their presence. Yet, like kites that had been cut free, the young prince had completely lost his connection to these flying swords. Yuan Juzi glanced back at the empty White Jade capital. He then retracted his gaze and sighed heavily, revealing, The 6 remaining flying swords have already been snatched away by that person. Even though he didn't take them beyond the sky with him, he's most likely tossed them in some place that no one knows about. In any case, it will be impossible for us to find them anytime soon. Even if we do manage to find them, it's hard to say whether we'll be able to get them back and use them. Song Jixin was only a young boy, after all. In just a night's time, he had suddenly transformed from an illegitimate son in an impoverished alley into a prince in one of Eastern treasured vile continent's most powerful empires. After arriving in the capital with a muddled mind, he had then been mysteriously taken to this tower. After overcoming numerous challenges and facing many struggles, he had finally managed to win the recognition of the 12 flying swords. At that moment, he had felt like he could finally stand up straight and hold his head up high when he talked to that bastard man. In the end, however, had all of his efforts been for nothing? After hearing Huan Zhuzi's reply, tears immediately started to trickle down Song Jixin's face. He bit his lips, and there were still streaks of blood on his face that he was yet to clean off. Huan Zhuzi didn't know how to encourage or console the young boy. In fact, even this old man who had experienced a bumpy life full of challenges was feeling shock and disbelief. Along with wanderers, Mahas still abided by the ancestral teachings of their first sage. Among these teachings was the notion that one should support the weak and aid weak nations in resisting humiliation and bullying from more powerful nations. However, Luan Changye had come to his own conclusion after reading the history books of several empires over several generations and traversing the lands of countless nations. What he saw and what he heard had led him to conclude this blindly supporting the weak and helping them patch things up here and there would only end in futility. Chaos would ensue for hundreds of years, and powerful generals would rise and fall one after another. In comparison to having a powerful empire uniting the land, attempting to fuel the resistance of weaker nations against a dominant empire would only lead to far more casualties. Thus, Luan Changye needed to choose a suitable empire and a suitable ruler to achieve his ambition. In the end, he had chosen Song Jingchun, the emperor of the Great Li Empire. Moreover, he hadn't been disappointed. Even after being attacked by Aoyang and suffering a severe setback to the monumental rise of the empire, Luan Changye still didn't feel like his decision was incorrect. His only downfall was the fact that the plans of humans could never rival the plans of the heavens. Even Luan Changye had to admit inferiority when it came to clashing with those mighty beings behind the scenes. However, he had still chosen to gamble. He had chosen to gamble everything for a chance to win unstoppable momentum to conquer the lands. The emperor smiled and said, "Can you two check on the White Jade capital to see if there's any issue with it? If that person's left any hidden traps, then I genuinely might as well smash my head against a wall and kill myself. While you two are busy with that, I'll also have an opportunity to have a private chat with Song Mu. However, let me say this first. You two have to promise me that you won't eavesdrop. The two of us are going to discuss some private family matters, so please excuse us." The two old men hurriedly stood up. One of them smiled and said he wouldn't eavesdrop, and one of them said he wouldn't dare to eavesdrop. The emperor looked up at the stubborn expression of the young boy. He patted the spot next to him on the step, and he imperceptibly crushed the jade pendant that was hanging by his waist. His voice was solemn as he said, "Here, sit down. From now on, I'm your father, Song Jingchun, and you're my son, Song Mu. It's probably better to call you Song Jixin. The passing down of flames, and the gathering of these flames. This is a very good omen." Song Yuzhang chooses tacky names for people, but it has to be said that he puts quite some thought into them. Song Jixin obediently sat next to the man. "I have to say, the fortune of great Sui nation's Gao clan is truly remarkable," the emperor said with emotion. "Also, your words truly did jinx the situation." Song Jixin felt slightly uneasy as he sat alone with his father. Even though he wasn't afraid of this man on the surface, through the attitudes of his uncle Song Changjing, his maidservant Jigui, and the two old men, he had indeed sensed the powerful control this man had over the Great Li Empire. The emperor appeared magnanimous and relaxed, yet he was actually filled with a sense of near-arrogant confidence on the inside. This was similar to that saber-wielding man's attitude toward Eastern treasured vile continent, and the world that this continent existed in. The emperor smiled and continued, "Since the 6 flying swords from the White Jade capital have failed to return, it will suffice to say that they've been lost. Then so be it. The sky won't collapse because of this." Song Jixin erupted in fury, shouting, "Then so be it? How can you dismiss it so casually? Luan Zhuzi and Mr. Lu told me before. The existence of these 12 flying swords signifies the direction that the Great Li Empire can take the entire continent in. The importance of them." The young boy didn't dare to continue. Moreover, he quickly came to his senses and recalled the fact that the creator of the White Jade capital and the flying swords wasn't him, but instead this resigned man beside him. The emperor gazed at the roof ridge of a distant imperial hall where a row of mythical beasts sat. His voice was soft as he said, "To the emperor of a nation, immense difficulties aren't something to be afraid of. As long as one can overcome these difficulties, this signifies the growth and strengthening of one's empire. If one can't overcome these challenges, however, this signifies one's lack of ability to rule over their nation. This unexpected obstacle that suddenly crashed down before us. Neither I nor the Great Li Empire were able to overcome it with just a small scare. This is very unfortunate. However, I don't feel any regret. Honestly, I'm not lying to you. Song Jixin couldn't understand this no matter what, so he asked, "Why?" The emperor's gaze became focused and intense, and there was no longer a shred of resignation or despondence to be found. He pointed at the roof ridge of the imperial hall and replied, "Because this increasingly proves the strategy that I laid out for the Great Li Empire to be correct. Cultivators, regardless of whether they're qi refiners or Dao cultivators, and regardless of whether they're good or bad, should all be locked up in a cage. The Great Li Empire won't stop them from becoming gods and immortals and seeking immortality. In fact, the Empire is even willing to help them achieve their ambition and glad to see them succeed. However, an empire must have a bottom line. At the very least, it needs to have a set of rules and regulations which these transcendent individuals must obey. They shouldn't be allowed to act as they please, wantonly moving mountains and rivers or picking fights with others simply because they want to. And in the end, the largest number of casualties is often suffered by those defenseless commoners of the empires. No, I want the citizens of my empire to respect and honor these transcendent beings not simply out of fear and trepidation. The future I desire is one where the Great Li Empire will have the confidence and power to seek justice for innocent commoners, even those on the lowest rung of society, and those viewed as ants by the transcendent beings if they're wantonly killed due to a battle between the transcendent beings." Song Jixin was absolutely stunned. His mouth hung open, yet he couldn't utter a single word. The emperor raised 2 fingers, leaving only a tiny gap between them, and he chuckled. "The justice that the Great Li Empire is able to give its people now is extremely small, only this small. Compared to the other nations in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent that slave away for the cultivators and immortals, however, the gulf between us is truly like the gulf between heaven and earth." He casually swung his wrist before clenching his hand into a fist and holding it up to the roof ridge in the distance, as if making a show of force against someone. "I sincerely hope that the Great Li Empire will be able to give its people this much justice in the future. Or perhaps even more." Song Jixin had already become numb with astonishment. For the first time, he felt like the man beside him was truly someone with flesh and blood. The emperor was no longer as cold and rigid as the dragon throne that he sat on and the dragon robe that he wore. The emperor turned around and asked, "Do you know which words from Aoyang angered me the most?" Song Jixin mustered his courage and replied, "When he told you to kowtow and apologize?" The emperor roared with laughter. He shook his head and explained, "As the ruler of this empire, I can die standing up, but I definitely can't live kneeling down. If I lack such resolve, how can the Great Li Empire march south to conquer the entire Eastern Treasured Vile Continent? If a person belittles themselves, then the heavens will naturally belittle them as well. If a person strives for self-improvement, however, then even the heavens will bestow them with help. It's best that you remember this." And the disparaging comments from the immortals that Eastern Treasured Vile Continent is the smallest continent in the world. However, do you genuinely know just how large this continent is? You can pick any history book in the world to read. Who has ever become the ruler of an entire continent? Song Jixin had a look of determination as he nodded and repeated, "If a person strives for self-improvement, then even the heavens will bestow them with help. I'll remember this." There was an expression of melancholy on the emperor's face as he continued, "What truly angered me was his claim that there are no capable fighters in the Great Li Empire. Not a single one. Step by step, I secretly advanced to the 10th tier of Qi refinement. This can already be regarded as amazing in Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. As a 10th tier martial artist, your uncle Song Changjing is even more powerful and impressive. Yet, what was the outcome? In his eyes, both of us were still regarded as not strong enough to fight with. However, fortune often accompanies calamity. This is the true reason why I was able to survive. One of the reasons. If I were at the 12th tier, and if he had felt like I was a capable opponent, perhaps he would have ended my life with a single slash." The emperor suddenly started to laugh heartily for some unknown reason. However, it felt like he was an aging hero who had already passed his prime. "A single slash?" Song Jixin asked, giving the man a painful reminder again. The emperor nodded and replied, "I can guarantee that a single slash would have been enough. He was a swordsman at the pinnacle of the 13th tier, a swordsman. That's why he can act so unreasonably." There was indecision on Song Jixin's face, and he opened his mouth to speak several times before eventually swallowing his words again. It was as if there were a nagging question on his mind that wasn't exactly easy to ask. The man leaned back and placed his hands on the floor, with his posture appearing carefree as he gazed up at the sky. Do you want to ask why he didn't kill us all before ascending to that place that no one knows about? Song Jixin roughly wiped his cheeks with the back of his hand before nodding in reply. Before telling you the answer, let me tell you this unfortunate news first. It's said that powerful individuals who have advanced to the 13th tier are capable of returning to the world. They can return to our mortal realm again. Even though this hasn't happened many times, there have been precedents, after all. However, for one reason or another, the 100 schools of thought and the powerful clans have all decided to keep this a secret. Song Jixin was quick-witted, and a look of shock immediately spread across his face. The chosen path before the Great Li Empire is still very long. The man sighed. This is a long road that we need to traverse with heavy responsibilities on our shoulders. But don't lose heart. In the end, he pointed at some place in the palatial complex and chuckled. There's a young boy almost completely raised by his mother here, and when he was young, he refused to go to Mountain Cliff Academy no matter what. I couldn't be bothered dealing with this and trying to change his mind. This child is very interesting, and if a dog on the streets shows any intention of wanting to bite him, he'll definitely kill it to make dog stew regardless of whether the dog truly wounded him or not. Perhaps he'll even find the family and relatives of the dog and kill them all as well. Only then will he feel satisfied. So, what about you, Song Jixin? I'll do the same, Song Jixin replied without hesitation. The man nodded and said, I was also like this when I was young. However, my temperament changed slightly after I ascended the throne. This was because I suddenly felt a little bored one day. The man turned around and said with a smile, However, it's good for one to have such temperament when they're young, forging ahead with determination and displaying their talent and vigor to the fullest extent. If others show respect, then tenfold the respect will be returned. If others offer humiliation, then humiliation they shall be given for life. This is what a man should be like. And I thought you would be very disappointed, Song Jixin said softly. The man patted his shoulder and replied, No, I'm not disappointed. If you didn't learn any true abilities at your young age, and instead learned how to read my expressions and use those techniques that the imperial officials use to speculate my thoughts, the so-called dragon-slaying techniques, then I would have been truly disappointed. Song Jixin leaned forward and placed his hands on his knees. Resting his chin on the backs of his hand, he said, But I know someone who might choose to act differently. The emperor sat up straight and placed his hand on the young boy's head. Believe my observations. That child holds grudges better than anyone else. It's just that he's endured far too much hardship ever since a young age, so he's already learned how to endure these situations and restrain himself. Becoming enemies with someone like this truly spells serious trouble. That's why I turned a blind eye to Green Ripple Pavilion's attempt at his life. However, you can relax. He's never treated you as an enemy, and this is especially the case after you performed those 2 menial actions on a whim. Song Jixin's face flushed beet red. However, it's hard to say what will happen when you one day become the emperor of the Great Li Empire. The man added, Since that person's ascended and won't return to the mortal world anytime soon, let's seize the opportunity to eliminate that what-if in a single breath. However, Song Jixin felt a little annoyed with himself immediately after saying this. He rejected his own suggestion and muttered, No, what if that person returns? Then the Great Li Empire will truly be destroyed. The man was amused, and he asked with a pleased smile, Do you feel like this is an unsolvable problem? Don't worry, that's because your position isn't high enough yet. Song Jixin felt a little deflated, and he could only console himself by thinking, if a person strives for self-improvement, then even the heavens will bestow them with help. Everyone needs 1 or 2 frenemies in their life. Only then will things become interesting. I had one when I was young, just like you do too. The man chuckled. There was a brief period of silence before Song Jixin reminded the man, You still haven't answered the question yet. Take your time and think about it yourself. My temper isn't good enough that I'll rub salt into my own wounds after being beaten half dead. Oh, that's right. There are only benefits and no drawbacks to becoming the owner of the White Jade Capital. I lied to your mother regarding this matter. However, I'm sure you know that I'm not lying to you after you lost control of the flying swords. As for the significance behind this, you need to contemplate it yourself. It's always good to give things a bit more thought. After revealing this secret, the man stood up slightly and was just about to leave. However, he suddenly sat back down and grabbed the young boy's palm, chuckling. "Let me read your palm for you. I have some elementary understanding of this art, but I've never had the opportunity to test it on anyone before. So let me test it out on you today." Song Jixin was slightly befuddled as he offered his palm to the man. As he observed the ridges on the young boy's palm, the man said casually, "You can continue to maintain a close relationship with your uncle, Song Changjing, 10 or 15 years into the future. However, you definitely can't grow reliant on him. As for canvassing him and getting this martial arts prodigy to be sincerely convinced by you, a junior, you can forget about this. My younger brother can't be bothered to even conceal his wild ambitions. Even as his older brother who's always been slightly more capable than him, I've still never dared to show any signs of wanting to tame this ferocious beast. Before you truly mature and grow powerful, you can only think about seeking revenge against those you resent in your mind, regardless of who they are. However, you definitely shouldn't act on these thoughts recklessly. Of course, you shouldn't harbor any ill will towards your uncle simply because of the few words I've said today. He's a genuinely outstanding talent. Otherwise, he wouldn't have uttered the sincere words. It can't be the case that heroes only exist in my greatly empire. So, perhaps he'll acknowledge you in the future as long as you become more capable than him in some area." After a short moment, the emperor smiled and left. Song Jixin clenched his fists and continued to rest his head on his knees. The emperor had spoken some vaguely understandable words. During this time, however, he had also imperceptibly drawn 4 characters on the young boy's palm. Lifespan 3. Be careful. Song Jixin suddenly looked up at the figure who was striding away and shouted, "Father!" The man turned around, smiling as he looked at Song Jixin. His expression appeared nothing like that of an emperor as he gazed at the young boy, just like that. This was a man whose true ambition was to speak the rules of the mortal world to all the transcendent deities and immortals. At this moment, it seemed like all of his life's efforts had been washed away by a rushing stream, silently, and without any trace left. Song Jixin stood up, with tears brimming in his eyes. He was biting his lips so hard that a wisp of blood was already flowing. He was just about to open his mouth to say something else. However, the man had already turned back around, his voice sincere as he said, "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Remember to eat your meals on time in the future." An old and travel-worn scholar exited Go Table Mountain and finally arrived at the foot of the mountain. After adjusting the luggage on his back, he placed his hands on his waist and moaned, "Oh, my old waist and old bones. Such torture, such painful torture." Luan Juzi and Mr. Lu returned inside White Jade Capital together. They directly walked up to the 12th floor, where there were only 2 straw-woven cushions on the floor. These weren't incredible artifacts that could aid chi refiners in cultivation, and they were instead ordinary items that even commoners could afford. After sitting down opposite each other, Mr. Lu smiled and asked, "When did you consult Qi Jingchun about building White Jade Capital?" Luan Juzi shook his head with a smile, replying, "Never. However, if I didn't say this, heaven knows what the eccentric Aoyang would have done. Perhaps he would have hacked us to death at the first disagreement." Mr. Lu faltered and asked in puzzlement, "Surely not, right?" Luan Juzi laughed heartily and said, "Of course I'm kidding. Aoyang most likely isn't this kind of person. However, what I told him afterward was indeed the truth. Qi Jingchun did indeed sacrifice most of his time and effort for the Great Li Empire. Moreover, he had high hopes for the future of the Great Li Empire and Eastern treasured Vile Continent. I'm sure that Aoyang understands this in his mind. Otherwise, Qi Jingchun wouldn't have founded Mountain Cliff Academy here, nor would he have offered lessons to everyone in the continent while residing in the Great Li Empire. Most of the people who graduated from Mountain Cliff Academy have already died of old age, though some of them are still alive. In any case, their acts of teaching and answering questions for the future generation of scholars can be viewed as an act of keeping Qi Jingchun's hopes and dreams alive." Wan Changye paused for a brief moment before asking, "Do you really think that these scholars don't feel any grievances regarding Qi Jingchun's death?" Mr. Lu remained silent as he pondered this. In the end, he slowly replied, "Due to the situation at that time, the Great Li Empire had no option but to choose the lesser of the 2 evils." Luan Juzi chuckled in reply, only touching the surface of the matter before drawing back. He immediately changed topics, saying, "In my opinion, today's commotion that has left us deeply wounded isn't as a result of the Great Li Empire attempting to flex its muscles and hunt that man. With Liang's cultivation base and the temperament that he displayed while traveling the continents back then, he isn't someone who would care about such trivial matters. I'm not entirely sure what's going through Liang's mind. Mr. Lu sighed. However, let me voice the opinion that you kept buried in your mind just then. At the end of the day, the knot in that man's heart is still related to Qi Jingchun. When facing pressure from all sides back then, the Great Li Empire didn't choose to step forward to support Qi Jingchun. Moreover, the Great Li Empire immediately shut down Mountain Cliff Academy once Qi Jingchun left. The empire abandoned him far too quickly. In fact, one can even suspect the empire of profiting from his misfortune. However, both you and I understand that this was genuinely the wisest move that the emperor could have made. In any case, I'm sure that most ordinary emperors and rulers wouldn't even feel an inkling of guilt when making such decisions. In their minds, wouldn't such decisions be natural and perfectly justified? Anyway, if we look at things from Liang's perspective, would our involvement and the Great Li Empire's act of actively challenging him appear like a cultivator at the lower 5 realms flaunting their strength before him? Luan Zhuzi asked. Not only that, but the cultivator was even puffing their chest in confidence, certain that they would win. Mr. Lu adjusted his sleeves and shifted his sitting position a little. There was a bitter smile on his face as he remarked, "Now that you say this, why do I feel like a bit of a clown?" Wang Zhuzi laughed and said, "If one day there were people like us people who can be considered relatively esteemed chatting about our deeds and marveling at our accomplishments, just how great would that be? Perhaps we would have had a glimmer of hope if we managed to successfully build the 13th floor of White Jade Capital." Mr. Lu sighed. "Now, however, it's far more difficult." Wang Zhuzi also sighed in emotion, saying, "I wonder which child from that group from the Great Li Empire will achieve the most surprising success in the future. I wager Songmu." Mr. Lu replied with a smile. "How about you?" Wang Zhuzi smiled with squinted eyes and replied half seriously, "I wager that young girl, Wang Shu." "What do you say?" The old man from the Lu clan of the School of Naturalists shook his head and chuckled. "A lone branch can offer brilliant flowers and appear superior to others. However, for it to become a forest will be difficult." Wang Zhuzi also shook his head, not offering a comment on this. He suddenly recalled something, and he asked, "Didn't Qi Jingchun also accept some other disciples while he was still in Jewel's small world? For example, Zhao Yao? Apart from him, I seem to remember that the School of Military Thought and the Taoist sect also fought over a child with the surname Ma." "Let's wait and see," Mr. Lu replied. "And let's hope that us two old geezers can live to see the conclusion of these tumultuous times." The maidservant Jigui had remained on the 10th floor of White Jade Capital the entire time. She hadn't gone elsewhere. While the others were distracted, she had climbed onto the windowsill and curled up her body, leaning sideways as she turned to look toward the south. She would glance at the sky, then glance at the south, and then repeat this again and again. She didn't appear bored in the least. For some reason, you always like to expound your ideas and reasoning to ants. In fact, you like to promote your grand principles even when it comes to me. Your life is more boring than anyone's, and your death will also be more miserable than anyone's. This is quite different from that person who you're seemingly very well acquainted with. He pays little heed to any of us, and he lives his life as carefree as could be. However, why do I still feel like you're a little better than him? Anyhow, regardless of who's better, this is simply something that I need to keep in mind. When it comes to interacting with people and dealing with matters though, I feel like one should be more like that strange person." In the end, the young girl squinted her golden eyes with twin pupils and chuckled. I just remembered that I'm not actually a person, am I?" She sat there in a daze. After a long while, she lifted a finger and ran it across her cheeks. Atop the city wall of the capital, two former allies stood face to face surrounded by a tense atmosphere. The woman wearing a palace dress shrieked, "Chui-chan, you recognized that person from the beginning, didn't you? So, in order to curry favor with him, you purposely opened the city gates and allowed him to charge to White Jade Capital? Your actions are punishable by death. Even executing you one time isn't enough. Do you think you'll be any better off once I'm punished and demoted? Is your brain malfunctioning or something?" The old Chui-chan, who appeared before others as a scholar dressed in green, remained calm as he replied, "If I didn't deactivate the capital's formation, would you believe me if I told you that my fate would be far more miserable? Not only that, but some of those standing in front of White Jade Capital would have inevitably been killed. The situation would have been far worse than the current one, where at least no one has died." Chui Chan chuckled coldly and continued. I know that the value of Song Jixin's existence has already been lost. He's no longer useful like he was before. After all, there's already no need for your other son Mgem and my good disciple to become the pagoda master of White Jade Capital, a perilous task where he might perish along with the swords. So, you're probably wishing that this lad could die and reincarnate as soon as possible. There was a beautiful smile on the woman's face, and she replied in a composed voice. Imperial Preceptor, why are you uttering such nonsense? Chui Chan didn't attempt to argue this point any further, and he said, following Mr. Lu's suggestion, we were initially going to use the capital's talismanic sword as the 13th flying sword of White Jade Capital. This is Talisman, the sword that's renowned throughout the continent, and that no one can unsheath. However, Wang Zhuzi felt that this was inappropriate, in the sense that this sword wouldn't be powerful enough to become the representative of the 13th floor. Moreover, we needed to sacrifice 2 divine weapons to split the gigantic dragon-slaying platform in Dragon Spring County, or as it was previously known, Jewel Small World. The Imperial Treasure Chamber was genuinely at low levels, and coincidentally, Talisman was renowned as the toughest sword on the continent. So, if we were lucky, it would have been able to deliver 3 strikes when wielded by a sword immortal. The woman frowned and asked, Chui Chan, what are you trying to say? Chui Chan ignored her and continued. However, the dragon-slaying platform was unexpectedly too large. After just 2 strikes, cracks resembling the cracked patterns on the pottery from the dragon kills in the small town spread across the blade of the sword. The internal sword essence was shattered. In other words, it was impossible to repair the sword. The emperor was pained by this, but he didn't assign blame to anyone. Instead, he decided to gift the sword to a woman named Donghua, who's none other than Her Majesty's maidservant. At the same time, however, he also issued a decree to assign her as the river god of the Iron Talisman River. As a result, Her Majesty has lost one of her most loyal and capable assistants. Am I correct? The woman smiled and replied, Are you trying to say that the Emperor is giving me a warning? Sure enough, Her Majesty is as beautiful and intelligent as always, Chui Chan said sarcastically. The woman replied with a cold chuckle. Chui Chan clicked his tongue and said, Why don't you contemplate the fate of the formal gods of the 5 mountains? The color instantly drained from the woman's pale and delicate face. She fell into deep thought, and it was as if she were a Go player reviewing a finished game. Chui Chan didn't interrupt her. Seizing the opportunity when Jewel's Small World fell to the ground, the Emperor had initially wanted to break the rules and elevate Cloud Drape Mountain, a mountain that was flowing with fortune, to the Great Li Empire's northern mountain. The awkward and peculiar thing was, the current 5 mountains of the Great Li Empire were all located to the north of Cloud Drape Mountain. Even though none of the formal gods of the 5 mountains had objected to this at the time, the statuses of these mountain gods and river gods were like a halfway point between cultivators in immortal sects and those in the cultivation world. It was as if tumultuous undercurrents had surged into the strategic pass of the empire in a single night. Cultivators from many sects and abodes had disguised themselves as devotees, ordinary people, or scholars as they visited the 5 mountains. They hadn't discussed matters pertaining to offerings and incense, and they had instead talked about the natural wonders and scenery. Meanwhile, the lower-ranked mountain gods and river gods in the surroundings had all fallen silent as if in tacit understanding. For some reason, however, the emperor, who was extremely autocratic when it came to some important matters, suddenly changed his mind. He abandoned his initial decision, which would have had great implications for the lifespan and fortune of the empire. Coincidentally, an outsider who dared to kill 2 Grand Masters of the Great Li Empire appeared at the same time. With the emperor's resolute nature, what followed afterward was a large-scale hunt that was great in both strength and impetus. The reason for this was simple: this was a battle that would influence the momentum of the Great Li Empire's march down south. It was a battle that would decide how many casualties the Great Li Empire suffered in their expedition to conquer the south. Otherwise, with the Great Li Empire's reputation as northern barbarians and eastern treasured vile continent, it was inevitable that many powerful and conceited gods and immortals would attempt to obstruct the iron hooves that charged toward the south. These mighty beings would definitely stand in their way to test the speed and power of their blades, as well as the power of their armored cavalry. They would probe whether the Great Li Empire genuinely had the right to stand on equal footing with them. The Great Li Empire naturally had its own immortal sects as well, with many of them being officially subordinate to the Imperial Song clan. This was further the case unofficially. However, this still wouldn't dissuade those cultivators who were like moths to a flame. The most terrifying people would be those tough and elusive qi refiners who specifically targeted the normal soldiers of the Great Li Empire to massacre. They would hammer one to death here, and slash one to death there. Not only that, but they would also resolutely retreat immediately after killing their targets. That being the case, how could the Great Li Empire deal with them? And thus, White Jade Capital was born, slowly rising from the ground. The first people to learn about this huge secret were the 12 mountain and river gods, members of the Great Li Empire that resided outside the capital. The Golden Clouds Mountain had initially wanted to assign Cloud Drape Mountain as the northern mountain of the empire and rescind the titles of the previous 5 mountains. Even though the emperor had subtly notified the formal gods about this, even giving each of them a clear promise, there was indeed still room for suspicion that he would kick them to the curb once they outlived their usefulness. Thus, it was somewhat understandable that the 5 formal gods had remained silent. After all, this was a decision that would impact their godly body and Tao foundations. Who dared to naively accept spoken or written offers? However, stepping forward to block and kill an enemy was completely different. This was something that aligned with the righteous direction of the empire, so there was no reason for the 12 gods who shared both honor and humiliation with the empire to prevaricate. Before exchanging blows with that saber-wielding outsider, these were indeed facts that couldn't be flawed. In fact, even the true bodies of the 6 gods who had suffered severe damage to their Tao manifestations most likely hadn't noticed any issues with this reasoning. This was especially the case since the Emperor's secret decree had clearly stated that they were only targeting a 10th tier cultivator, or perhaps an 11th tier cultivator. Even after the matter, they still felt the same way. This was the case even though they had suffered a resounding defeat. From the Emperor himself to the creator of White Jade Capital, and then to the 6 formal gods of the mountains and rivers, it appeared as if all of them had ended up as losers. However, this was because not a single one of them had anticipated that their opponent would be so powerful. When they eventually revealed this truth to the world, the Great Li Empire might even unintentionally experience glory even though they had been defeated. Even so, Cui Chan still felt a sense of lingering apprehension as he stood atop the city wall. This was because the Emperor managed to achieve some parts of his goal despite suffering defeat. Among the formal gods of the 5 mountains, only the god of the central mountain who was forever loyal to the Great Li Empire and the god of the northern mountain who had been in the worst situation before had managed to keep their Tao manifestations unharmed. The Tao manifestations of the 3 other formal gods had all been wiped out, causing their cultivation base to fall drastically. In fact, they had almost fallen to the level of ordinary mountain gods. Becoming as feeble as they were now, they lost the power and confidence to challenge the Emperor when it came to the matter of reassigning the 5 mountains. However, this wasn't the most terrifying part. In the past, the Emperor had asked Cui Chan a question while they were enjoying a hearty conversation. The Imperial Preceptor had thus mentioned some of his knowledge gained from experience, saying that rulers could sometimes consider those who had made mistakes or faced punishment in the past when deciding on which official to use. In fact, rulers could even consider putting these people into important positions. This was because they had been punished and taught a lesson before, so with this memory in mind, they would be especially obedient. If one day the formal gods of the 5 mountains, excluding the formal god of the central mountain, realized the hidden undercurrents of this miserable defeat, they would most likely develop a feeling of resentment toward the Emperor of the Great Li Empire. However, the previous formal god of the northern mountain who had suffered punishment for supporting the wrong side before would only feel a sense of increasing